Well, I think probably the best way of understanding motivation is why we do something and why we don't do something else. Because, in life we're always presented with many, many options, and we choose to do certain things and we ignore or reject other possible outlets for our energy. So I think that's a good way of understanding motivation. It's also perhaps about why we put certain degree of effort into an activity, why we persevere with it, why we carry out something with intensity, whereas in other situations perhaps we don't put the same amount of energy into what we're doing. So I think that's motivation as well. I don't think you need to be a professor to say that it's important. I think everyone who's learned a language, whether successfully or whether they struggled, realise that motivation is something that has a significant impact. In terms of language motivation theory, it's been a very discrete area with very few sort of crossover or links with mainstream motivation in mainstream psychology, and that's interesting. So the concepts that have been developed have been very much related to language learning, and two concepts which many people might have come across are integrative and instrumental motivation. Now, integrative motivation is all about an identification with groups of people who speak the language, and perhaps wanting to be in some way like them and imagining oneself as being like them at some point in the future. Whereas instrumental motivation is more about what can language give me? What benefits can I gain from learning a new language? So thinking in terms of career, job possibilities, those types of things. So those are kind of classic concepts. But in more recent years, it's been sort of suggested that maybe we can understand motivation to learn a language in terms of a sort of more internal identification. So imagining myself as someone who interacts with specific people in the future in the language that I'm learning. Imagining myself being a competent speaker of the language, or possibly a number of languages in the future, as a kind of sense of developing a particular or special identity. So that's something that's very specific to language learning. But of course, there are other theories as well. We can, for example, talk about self-determination theory, which is quite well known, the idea about intrinsic and extrinsic motivation. That some types of motivation, we do things because we're interested in them, we enjoy them, and we're kind of motivated to continue and to put a lot of effort into them. Whereas other things we do, not perhaps because we enjoy them so much, but because we feel we ought to, because we feel that there's some sort of expectation, and that it might be good for us, in fact, in the long run, so therefore we'll put energy into it. And those theories, which are kind of as I say, well known, they've been applied in second language learning as well. Yeah, most of my research has been done in Sweden, and that makes an interesting context in many senses. Not least because you have English in sort of all aspects of Swedish society, and many people have sort of high levels of proficiency in English. So a lot of my research has been focused on looking at the effects that English has on motivation to learn other languages. So I've done a few studies where I've looked at the impact that English has on motivation to learn modern languages, so French, German and Spanish. But I've also looked at the way that English can both facilitate but also perhaps constrain or hamper the efforts of people who come to Sweden as migrants, who have English in their background, in their language repertoires, and who are learning Swedish. So in some ways, it can be quite helpful because there are a lot of linguistic similarities between English and Swedish, particularly if you have, say, Arabic or Thai or whatever is your native language. And that's great because English can kind of give you a head start. But there are kind of downsides as well, in the sense that it's very easy to get by with English. It's very easy to rely on English in sort of day-to-day interactions. And what I've been able to see in my research is that for many people who have English in their backgrounds, the a point in time when they become fluent in Swedish, or where they become sort of willing to communicate in Swedish, becomes delayed, simply because they're relying on English in everyday interactions, so they don't sort of maximize the affordances that there are to learn Swedish. we have to recognise that people learn languages for different reasons. And if you are learning languages for an instrumental reason, I would say, stick with that. Think about the benefits that are going to accrue as a result of learning languages. And those benefits might be sort of material benefits, but they can also be personal benefits in the sense that you become perhaps a more cosmopolitan individual, that you're perhaps able to kind of develop an empathy with people who are non-native language speakers, that you perhaps become closer to other cultures, you get another understanding of cultures. So I've interviewed quite a lot of school students who are learning modern languages, and they talk about sort of opening doors, that, being able to speak French or being able to speak Spanish gives them sort of an outlook on life, if you like, that they might not have had if they didn't. And I think another thing that, in a Swedish context can be motivational, particularly for foreign languages, is that, let's face it, everybody, speaks English. So if you speak Swedish and English, big deal. You're run of the mill, just like everybody else. But if you also speak French or Spanish or a little bit of Italian or whatever it might be, that kind of makes you somehow special. So a lot of people talk about it being in terms of a kind of personal identity project, developing something special about me. And I think that can be a sort of important source of motivation. But I think also that what we need to do is we need to, when we're learning languages, to kind of like visualize mentally the type of situations that we might find ourselves in using the language. So if I'm learning French, I would have that sort of image of the sidewalk cafe in Paris, on a nice spring morning, drinking my coffee. That would be kind of sort of foremost in my mind, so that I can imagine myself in situations where I'll be interacting in a natural environment. And I think that's something that language teachers can do, not just occasionally now and then, but as sort of part of everyday teaching, create those opportunities for students to make those types of mental visualization, to imagine themselves, put themselves mentally in those type of situations. And there's been research on the importance of vision and imagery that shows that it has positive effects.